Hello and welcome to another episode of Phosphorus Live. Today I'm excited to be joined by my friend Mike Holcomb. Mike and I have been connected for years through social media, but we didn't get to meet until the first time at Level Zero in Atlanta here last month. So it was good to finally get to meet you in person, Mike.
Yeah, definitely. It was a surprise. Yeah, I looked up and saw you standing there.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. There's several other people that I got to meet for the first time there that I hadn't met in person. So Clint was we were discussing earlier. Clint and I have been around the same conferences. We've actually seen each other before, but never
Yeah,
formally introduced.
yeah, yeah. No, it was a great conference, and yeah, it was. Yeah, no, I was happy we got to meet like that.
Yeah, it's good to see more OT and ICS conferences starting to pop up because I know there was like some of the big ones. Was the big one S4 is the big one that in Orlando each year?
Yeah, S4 is the one they actually are doing. We're in Tampa this year, and he's going back to Miami next year, and then Tampa apparently is going to be the home moving forward. We also do actually started B-Sides ICS this year as well. So the day before S4, which is a Monday, is B-Sides ICS now, which we had a great show. I thought this year because it's really, yeah, we get some of the best in the world in OT cybersecurity from S4, but we also get, had a couple hundred people there. About a third of the people were brand new to OT. So we had folks brand new to OT. We had again the best of the best and everybody in between, and just let everybody come and hang out for the day, and it was really exciting.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome, especially with and also the whole B-sides ICS, that's pretty nice. At least that's gonna make it more accessible to people because some of the other conferences are not always cheap. So,
No,
kinda nice to be able to have that out there. So yeah, I
yeah,
thought whenever, was looking for a guest for Phosphorus Live, I thought it'd be good to bring you on because your education background, because you educate folks in this space. And me, I've only had a little bit of exposure to this. I got to take one of the SANS ICS pen testing courses. Justin Searle wrote the course,
yeah,
and Don Weber taught it. So that was
yeah,
back in 2020. I was working for a company that had a lot of ICS in their factories, and so I got to
sure.
go for that training. So
Oh, very
still a
cool.
lot more for me to learn, and so it's been an area that I'm looking into diving into more, that and IoT. So I thought it'd be great to have you on to kind of share some educational stuff around OT and ICS. But
Sure.
before we get started, why don't you share your background with our listeners?
Sure. My background is I grew up as a kind of traditional like computer nerd, I guess. But I also grew up with a traditional hacker kitty. And so my buddy Chris, he was the one that was cracking games, and so you could copy them illegally, right? And he'd make cheats for games so you get unlimited gold, unlimited lives, and so that I used to always watch what he did. I'm a good kid. I would never do any of these things, but I just was very fascinated. And then there was also this idea of what, would somebody do if they, if they're a bad person, right? Or if they had evil intent, right? What could they use computers to do? And that just always stuck with me. So, my first job in high school was doing QA testing in IT, and I've worked almost my entire career in IT cybersecurity. That's just what I always gravitated towards and wanted to do. And then in 2010, when Stuxnet hit, that's where the Americans and Israelis created a ICS or OT specific piece of malware to go in and physically break down the centrifuges in Iran that would be used to enrich uranium gas to build nuclear weapons. And I was just absolutely fascinated with they used a piece of malware, right, to be able to control these systems in the real world and break them down. I think even more importantly, there is the operators at the plant. They were sitting there in the operations room, and everything looked like it was perfectly fine. So that was the real beauty. Not only were they breaking these systems down, but they made it look like everything was perfectly fine to the operators. And yeah, that just always stuck with me, and so I was always wondering, well, how does this work in a power plant? Like, do we have computers in power plants, right? I had no idea. And I started that journey in 2010, and very shortly after that, about 2011, I got a job at Fluor, where I'm still at today for my day job, and we just happened to be one of the world's largest um, engineering firms. That we also oversee construction and procurement, but we design, engineer, and build some of the world's largest control system environments for some of the world's largest companies. And so I get to work with some of the best engineering minds in the world. And so just back in the day, after I still had IT cybersecurity responsibilities, and I still do things like oversee threat and vulnerability management and offensive security, but also help build out and lead our OT cybersecurity practice. So when we're building these environments, we're working customers, working with them like Shell, Saudi Aramco to not only build these large projects, but making sure that they're secure. So that's me in a nutshell. And then in there, I've just always kind of wanted to share information. I think kind of like we were touching on in a site conversation, but there's not a lot of there's really wasn't any like approachable educational content around OT cybersecurity. And I remember when going back to 2010, when I tried to start to learn, it's like I was so frustrated because it was just roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And that still exists somewhat today. It's getting better. But so I wrote a course that I wish I had, 10 plus years ago, as that introduction into the OT cyber world. And that's kind of where I've put that on YouTube and built, other courses that are on YouTube as well, and doing other content. And I do deliver them, live from time to time, but it's really about getting that information about for folks to learn more about OT cyber. And then if you're in an OT ICS environment like a power plant or a water treatment facility or manufacturing, it's here's how to build your program. Right? Here's how to secure your facilities, and it doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be mysterious. So after all that, but that's that's kind of the me in a nutshell.
So yeah, that's awesome what you're doing. So, when did you get started on the education side with OT and ICS?
So that was I started building like training programs internally at Fluor probably up to like 10 years ago. And I did Security Plus for our, like hundreds of internal IT and information security team members, and then started working with the engineers, right, to help them learn from an just the basics of cybersecurity. And then as we were building the OT cybersecurity program, it was like, well, we definitely need more training around, for the engineers, not only to understand the basics of cybersecurity, but how to apply those in a plant. And every plant environment is different. They all have very common similarities, but a power plant has unique needs, right? That a water treatment facility doesn't have, that a manufacturing plant doesn't have. So it's the idea of here's the basics of cybersecurity, which are very similar to how they are in IT, right? IT and OT have much more in common than they don't. People in OT will tell you that's not true, and I I don't know what to say other than maybe they think that, but I will always say IT and OT are much more similar than they're not. Now, I think what's key, and I think what the OT folks are trying to communicate is where they are different, they're very different, right? Vulnerability management, penetration testing, right? These are things that are very different in the OT world, because in the OT world, we do worry about safety, right? Making sure, yeah, everybody that's on site in that plant, they go home at the end of the day, right? If patching a system and just rebooting it, right, in the middle of production could actually literally get somebody hurt or killed or bring down the plant, yeah, that's not something that we're going to do. right? And same thing with penetration tests. So we're not just going to go into a plant and start scanning and running Metasploit and gaining access to systems and moving, throughout the environment because yeah, you could bring down the plant or you could get somebody hurt or killed. So yeah, they're very, very similar, but where they are different, it's important to understand those differences. So that way, yeah, we keep the plants up and running and we keep everybody safe. So yeah, it was really going back to the question was really just building out this content for Fluor. And then I realized I'm like, I was building all of this out on my own time. And so so it really just became, well, if I'm building this out on my own time, it's I probably should just share this with others. And, if it helps one person, then awesome, so I started putting it out on you. I created new courses, brand new, doesn't have any floor content. I do share some stories, right, without specifics to clients, and put that out on YouTube. So
Yeah, it's great to see what you're doing. I love community and like to see people sharing and giving back because sometimes education can be expensive, or sometimes people don't know where to find it. Because one of the things I've ran into over the years is I've had people that are wanting to get into pen testing, and they would be asking me about certain questions, where to find these resources. And one of the things too is if you don't understand an area enough, even Google can be a challenge because you don't know the right keywords to find what you're looking for.
right. Yeah, it's like how do you yeah, you just don't know what to look for. You don't know what you don't know, right? And that was kind of the approach I took with the getting started in OTICS cybersecurity course because it really was let's start from step 0, and it ended up being almost, I think, 26 hours of content. The new version that I'm working on, I'm almost done, will probably be closer to 40. But it literally is taking somebody from this is, for folks that do have at least some IT cybersecurity background and taking them from knowing nothing about OT to this is how we can defend successfully OT environments from even state adversaries.
So would you recommend someone have some basic IT understanding before trying to learn this content?
I do, I do. It's and usually you'll see when people come, and you might say you mentioned the SANS course. So typically you'll see people come from the OT world, the engineers and the technicians that work in the plants, and then you'll see people come from an IT cybersecurity background. So anybody can come and take the courses and still get a lot of great information out of it. But it's one of those where you'll get so much more out of it if you have an IT background, if you have at least the basics of networking, if you have a basic IT cybersecurity background, because that's where we can talk about things like vulnerability management and penetration testing, and you can see in OT, we might not ever apply patches ever. And so it's yeah, the more background you have, like anything, right? Sure, the more you'll get out of the course. But I think people can come to the course not knowing anything and still get a lot out of it. And I get some feedback from folks with no background, and they seem to enjoy it.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned earlier too how these types of systems can affect people physically. It could cause harm to someone. It could cause losses.
Yeah.
Are are people starting to buy in? The people that are working on the manufacturing side and management, are they starting to buy in and accept the need for OT security? Are they starting to be a little easier with accepting that and being on board with having some kind of security in place?
It's interesting because as I mentioned, right, I've been in IT cyber forever, like you, right? And I remember screaming into the void, for 10 plus years about how businesses needed cybersecurity. And then the Target breach happened, right? And then all of a sudden, every business at least knew they probably should start thinking about cyber, right? And we had in the OT world Colonial Pipeline. When the Colonial Pipeline breach happened, we actually are coming up on the 4-year anniversary on Wednesday. So when that happened, that was the one event that for most OT environments, they realized they need to at least start thinking about cyber. Now, manufacturing, unfortunately, is one of those environments or sectors where they are so far behind on cyber that they are very vulnerable. And since Colonial Pipeline, uh, yes, Colonial Pipeline helped OT owners and operators understand that we need to do something about cyber, but it also helped the attackers understand, oh, there's this thing out there called OT, and if we attack it, we can get paid even faster. And so we saw, almost 2,000 ransomware attacks against OT environments. And that's both, the IT networks that they're connected to, and some of those, like with Colonial Pipeline, where the ransomware or attackers start also moving into OT environment, and you have to shut down out of an abundance of caution, or you're brought down, right? And and so as you see the kind of that transition, that we're this place we're at today is more environments understand they need to do something, and again, the attacks are only increasing. We're seeing manufacturers going down. We're seeing other types of plants going down. The problem is, and in my day job, I get to work with the largest companies in the world that invest heavily in their cybersecurity programs in OT, right? Shells and the Ramcos of the world, second to none. The majority, though, of OT environments out there, they're small manufacturers, right? They're small water treatment uh, facilities that maybe they'll provide water, to a small town of 1,200 people. They don't have anybody for OT cyber, let alone OT, let alone even IT cyber, right? So the vast majority of environments out there, they just don't have the resources, which was another reason why I wanted to make the courses available, so at least people could get the knowledge. And so that's kind of where we're at today, though, is a lot of people now have it on their radar and they know they need to do something about it. But the majority of these environments, they just don't have the resources. They don't have the budget. They don't have the people. And so you're kind of at, like, what do we do?
So do you think critical infrastructure is becoming a more of a target, or you think it's just a factor that we're realizing that it has been a target?
No, I think it really has since Colonial Pipeline. That was where the attackers really woke up to, oh, there's this thing called OT, and we can target these environments to make money, and we'll get paid, and we'll get paid fast. And they are, right? Because if, oh, I like with Colonial Pipeline, that was the largest gasoline pipeline in the United States. And people on the East Coast had interrupted gas supplies at the stations, for a week and a half, almost 2 weeks. So there's like this real world impact. Rob Lee, he did our keynote at B-Sides ICS this year. He is, for most people, undoubtedly like the thought leader in OT cybersecurity today. And he makes a point of saying, and I've no listened to Rob for I don't, since pretty much 2011, 2012 probably. um I've just got to know him a lot more the last year or two, but always in the past he was always the person that said, we can defend these environments, but you don't need to, the sky's not falling, right? Just calm down, right? Implement things as you have time. And now fast forward to 2025, and he's like, yeah, that was in the past. He's like, the world has changed. The ICSOT cybersecurity world has changed, and there is a lot coming. And if you just look at the pattern of attacks and the exponential increases since Colonial Pipeline, and the real world impacts that are only increasing, that we're not prepared for what's coming. We're not. and he's right. I wish he was wrong, you know, but he's, he's not, because you can look at, again, just the numbers and the increase in attacks that have been exponential, especially since Colonial Pipeline. Before Colonial Pipeline, you might talk about an OT cyber attack once literally every 2 or 3 years. That was it. I mean, I remember kind of like, being at OT, it's like, wow, there's not a lot happening, but I still firmly believe this is where I belong. And now it's, there are events every day.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's the one area of cyber that not only is it the attack is digital, but you can have, that physical or kinetic effect that otherwise other digital stuff you usually don't. You can get access to
Yeah.
data and do things, but just to be able to impact people, just like you mentioned, the Colonial Pipeline. And I forget the exact year in details. I think it was around the end of 2023 when there was a water treatment plant that was
Yeah.
attacked
So
somewhere.
so end of 2023, that's where we saw what they call like the Unitronics attacks, or some people refer to it the Cyber Avengers attacks. So I still think it's kind of a funny name, but with you had a hacktivist group called the Cyber Avengers that were targeting these combination PLC HMI. So what those are, for folks that aren't familiar, in the most common type of control system we have is a programmable logic controller, or PLC. It's just like your thermostat you have at home or at the office, right? It brings in data from a sensor, like, reads what the temperature is. And then if it needs to make a change to the environment, like, oh, it gets too hot, it sends a signal to the air conditioning unit to turn on, right? And then it's continually monitoring the environment and realizes, okay, the room's back to the set point, or the desired temperature. So it'll send another signal just to turn the air conditioner off. And so we have these PLCs everywhere in control systems. And then to be able to monitor what that PLC is controlling, right? They have, usually it's on a separate system. You'll have a screen, like a GUI, right? And it'll just show you, you might see a picture of the air conditioning unit, right? And you'll see 72 degrees, and you'll have buttons to put it up and go down, and turn it on or turn it off, just like a normal thermostat. And so in this case, yeah, at the end of 2023, they had these combination PLCs, HMIs, and they were manufactured in Israel. And so Cyber Avengers, they're aligned with Iran. So they said, we're targeting these pieces of equipment because they were manufactured in Israel. And where you would find these pieces of equipment were typically water treatment facilities. The first one that actually got hit was in South Carolina. Don't hear about that one, but it was. But I think there was one in Pennsylvania that was the first one that came out. I actually saw it on Reddit, and there was a guy that ran a brewery, and he had one of these that was running his brewery setup. And what was happening was these were getting connected to the internet. They're exposed to the internet with default passwords. And so people would just, the cyber avengers would find them, connect to them, log in with the default password of 1111. And then they would just upload their own image for that, the GUI, the HMI. And so that's what you would see. And they would bring down the PLC so it would stop the function. So in OT, the nice thing is, like, if I had a power plant that was attacked and it just went down, right, and kind of take safety out of off the table, um, for now, it's, if it goes down because we lose our computers that control the plant. Same thing that was happening in these water treatment and facilities and breweries, was you can fall back to manual operations. Right? You can still turn the valves and click the buttons to, right, to make things move and run. So like when the Ukraine lost power because the Russians used cyber weapons, and then eventually living off the land just to create blackouts, they could still fall back to manual operations. Yeah, it takes 4 or 5 hours to restore the power, but you can get back up and running. So I know I digress, but the so yeah, with the water attacks, it really highlighted that you there are these pieces of equipment out there. They are vulnerable, right? Thankfully, the only incident I heard out of all of those systems that were compromised, there was only one actual impact to the real world. There was 160 people in Ireland that lost water for 2 days, which might to a lot of people that'd be like, no, that's not a big deal. But at the same time, what if it's 16,000 people without water for 2 days, or what if days is 2 weeks, or 2 weeks is 2 months? Right? You can have those types of events or incidents in the OT world. So thankfully, with cyber avengers, right, there very little technical skill, right? Think of though what could happen with somebody that has moderate technical skills, and what could they do in an OT environment.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So, you kind of mentioned HMI and PLCs. If you wouldn't
Mm.
mind giving kind of like a little overview of OT architecture and kind of discuss what those items are and some of the other components of OT environments.
Sure, sure. I need a whiteboard, but yeah, a lot of times we'll start with what we call the Purdue model, which talks about how IT and OT talk to each other. Now, and that's what it was designed for back in the day. And I have friends that actually had created the framework. Um, Over time, it's been adopted to, I mean, some people use it to have a discussion on how do we secure OT, or at least start to have those conversations. I think it's a great starting point, right? Because almost every OT environment, right? If I have a power plant, right? If I have that power plant, almost always, unless it's nuclear, right? That's whole other world. But it's if I have a power plant, it's going to be connected to an IT environment. If I have a manufacturing facility, it's going to be connected to an IT environment. And a lot of those environments have communication going back and forth between them. Now, it shouldn't be that way, but that's typically how they're set up initially. So when you also think, okay, well, I have a power plant and it's connected to an IT network. Well, the IT network, it's connected to the internet, right? Because everybody has to browse the web and get their email. And so just like any IT environment, if it becomes compromised, right, that's going to give the attacker or ransomware or some other infection a foothold on that IT network. And then it's going to move right into the OT network, into the plant network, if there's no protection, right? That's essentially what happened in Colonial Pipeline, where they had to shut down the pipeline itself for a week and a half. And so we use the Purdue model to look at, okay, we have IT, IT's connected to the internet. We have the plant network. Well, in between those, we're going to put a DMZ. And this wasn't in the original model, but the idea is, right, just like you have a DMZ between the internet and IT, right, we now have a DMZ between IT and OT. So we can have those additional layers of protection, right? Filtering, right? So that way we only allow, ideally, OT to send data to IT, right? If I have a manufacturing plant and I manufacture your Barbie dolls, right? I'm Mattel, sitting over on the business side. I need to know how many Barbie dolls we manufactured, right? So we can coordinate things like storage, shipping, logistics. And we have an idea of how much money we can expect to make at the end of the day, right? Some environments also set it up so IT can reach in and get that OT data off of those systems. The problem is if you're giving IT the ability to reach into OT, that's where, right, if an attacker or ransomware gets into the environment, it also has that path. And that's where a lot of environments get into trouble. Right? But so we talk about the Purdue model that talks about, hey, we have IT and OT talking with each other. We're going to put a DMZ between the two to help limit communication as much as possible. And then when we look inside the OT plan, and this is where is one of the things that blew my mind when I went to my first plant, which was one of the Western Hemisphere's largest power plants, and walked in there, and the plant manager was really excited to give me a tour. And I was super excited to be there. He's like, "Well, let's go in the data center." I was like, "Okay, great." And the data center is right by the operations room, so you see everybody sitting behind the consoles with all the lights and watching to make sure everything was operating. And then he starts talking about, well, here's our domain controllers, and here's our file servers, right? And here's our data historians, and oh, they run Windows and SQL Server. And I was like, I feel like I'm in the IT world. Like, are you sure, right? This is the OT side. And I think what a lot of people don't realize, which I didn't, right? 12 years ago, plus years ago, was there's a lot of Windows in OT. And so when you look at the OT plant and you're looking at it from that Purdue model, it's broken up into basically levels 0 through 3. The higher levels, those are all Windows machines, almost always. And then you start to get into machines like, oh, we have the PLCs, right? So we use the Windows machine. I might have what they call an engineering workstation. An engineering workstation, that's just a name for a Windows laptop that I use to connect to a PLC to program it. Just like if you were, configuring a Cisco switch, right? You could do that over the network, right? If it's connected over Ethernet and it has an IP address, or you could go and you can connect directly to it using a R2 or RS-232 cable, right? So it's the same thing. But so if you think the OT side, right, you have all of these Windows machines really that you're using to collect data about how the plant runs, and then to configure systems like the PLCs and the HMIs, the GUIs that allow us to see what's actually going on in the environment and give us buttons to be able to make changes and respond if we need to. And so we're watching all of that. And then from those PLCs, then that's where they're physically wired into the systems themselves that are out in the real world moving, right? So I mentioned if I have that PLC connected to, that's acting as my thermostat, that gets too warm, then it sends the signal to turn on the air conditioning, right? And it always has that sensor always checking the temperature. If I have a power plant, I have that PLC that's sitting there, and in that power plant, I have a turbine, right? And that turbine spins to spin a generator to create electricity. Well, we want to monitor different aspects of that turbine, right? Is it going too fast? Is it going too slow? What if the temperature is starting to rise, right? And then we need to be able to take action. So we have controllers, right? These systems. I get in trouble with engineers, but I say just computers. They just have a lot of extra wires coming out of them, right? Because they're physically wired into these generators and turbines, right? But it's a computer, right? It has an operating system, firmware, right? Memory, right? It has storage space, little storage, but they don't have like 10 terabyte Excel spreadsheets they're worried about, right? But you have these, controllers connected to these systems. And so when you start to get into thinking of this, and I'm sure you can appreciate, like from either a penetration testing perspective or an attacker perspective, I think if somebody gets into your IT network, well, IT networks still, right, for the most part, are still primarily Windows machines. And you might have Linux servers to a degree, but you still have mostly Windows machines. And right, attackers usually run rampant, right, from Windows machine to Windows machine. And if you have that path right into OT, they'll move right into OT. Well, now remember, those, a big part of the OT network, it's made out of Windows systems. And so they're just going to go through and they're going to run rampant through all those Windows systems as well. Where they get to slow down is, oh, I just came across this programmable logic controller. It's like, oh, where the attackers kind of stop. And this is where you kind of see, is it a state adversary or is it a ransomware operator or kind of a hacktivist, somebody without skills. If it's a state adversary, like with Volt Typhoon, right? They're going to sit in the environment. They're going to collect the data. They're going to reverse engineer the process. So one day they could potentially create an explosion, or they could bring down the plant, right? Activists and others with less skill, right? They'll come across something like a controller, and they might not know like what it's actually connected to, and they're not going to take the time to figure it out. The Cyber Avengers, there was actually a story where they talked about they had compromised a water treatment facility in Israel. I was like, wow, oh, that's fascinating. And they're like starting to provide screenshots. And so they had got to the HMI. What they what they were seeing though, was it a water treatment facility? Yes. But what it was actually it was the chlorine tank pump system for a hotel swimming pool. Right. And that's kind of very like a great example of what OT attackers are up against. Right? Because they get into an environment, and if they don't know, oh, I'm in a power plant or I'm in a manufacturing facility, right? They just know I'm on a bunch of Windows systems. And then they get to a controller, right? They know, okay, there's something on the other side of that controller, but they have no idea what it is, right? And the swimming pool example is yeah, I think highlights that. So then again, you have to take time to reverse engineer what's going on in the environment for more advanced attackers if they want to have that true impact. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that, yeah, these PLCs and other types of controllers and systems we have in OT, they were designed 20, 30 plus years ago. The protocols that they run were designed 20 plus 30, 30 plus years ago. Nobody was thinking about security back then. And so when you look at the most commonly used protocol on PLCs, it's called Modbus. Modbus is not only is it unencrypted, which that's a whole other story, but we don't really worry as much about encryption in OT as in IT. But the main point with Modbus is it's unauthenticated, right? So you can connect to it and you can issue it commands, and it'll do whatever you want. Modbus is kind of like SNMP, right? So there's a database that's sitting there with values, and the idea is you might go back to the thermostat example. I set the desired temperature to 72 degrees. So if you can connect to that controller and you read that value, it says 72. Well, what if I change it to 68, right? Or I change it to 76? The controller over the wire, because it's running Modbus, it doesn't care. It's going to let me do whatever I want. So you can read from it, right? You can read all those values, which if you see a bunch of numbers, you might not, and this is, again, goes back to when we first start looking, we might not know what any of this means, right? We have to take the time to reverse engineer it. If we're a more advanced attacker, a hacktivist, a ransomware operator, they might just start changing every 0 to a 1, right? Or every 1 to a 0, or just change every number to a 0. Could that cause some type of issue? It could. Right? Could it blow something up? Potentially. We never say never, right? But more than likely, it would cause like an issue somewhere. The Russians actually used this at the end of 2023 or no, this is January of last year of 2024, where they went in to the controllers in apartment buildings in Ukraine, and they manipulated the values on the PLCs to turn off the heating in the middle of winter, sub-zero temperatures outside. And again, it's all because these controllers were using Modbus unauthenticated protocol, and you could just basically go in and say, oh, 72 degrees? No, just make it 32 degrees. So basically the heating turns off. Kind of simplifying it, but you get the idea.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
it's
it's
pretty interesting. And then when you mention the things about temperatures, I mean, this could be meat packing facilities, or maybe even blood or something that's critical to
Right?
stay the proper
That's
temperature. Yeah, that these are really risky.
Exactly. That's where you really get concerns where, right, pharmaceuticals, like you mentioned, food and agriculture. There was just a story I was looking at yesterday, right, where they're going in and actually, yeah, looking at how they can. I think it was a chicken plant actually here in South Carolina where the attackers had got in and started messing with the chemicals in the cleaning system for the facilities to where, yeah, you start introducing these uh, issues, right? To where you have maybe spoiled or contaminated food getting out to the public and people getting sick or potentially dying. That's the point we're at right now. And this is, I think, what Rob Lee was trying to highlight in the keynote. We're right on the edge. And there's a lot of us in OT, out there, trying not to be the sky is falling, but we're saying, just look at the numbers, look at the metrics, and let's at least implement the basic fundamentals of OT cybersecurity to reduce your risk in your environment the most to protect your clients and the general public.
Well, thanks for taking time to join us today. That was very informative, and I hope folks on here that are kind of new to OT and ICS get something from this. And if you look at the ticker across the bottom, folks, you've got Mike's LinkedIn as well as his website. If you go to his website, you can find a link to his YouTube channel. So check that out. If you see Mike at a conference, go up and say hello to him and let him know that you appreciate him sharing all this great information. So thanks for being a guest, and thank you for what all you're doing for the community. It's much appreciated.
Anytime. Yeah, definitely. No, thanks, Philip. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was great, and hopefully this will help somebody out there for
And
sure.
for everyone listening, if you're not a customer of Phosphorus and you want a way to more easily handle your cybersecurity in your OT and IoT environments, check us out. We can help you with that. So thanks everyone, and we'll be coming back on June 5th. So appreciate everyone joining. This it's been a pleasure and honor to host my first episode. Looking forward to many more. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.